Part 6. The Versailles System and the Return to Normalcy, 1919 to 1929. Chapter 15. The Peace Settlements, 1919 to 1923. The First World War was ended by dozens of treaties signed in the period 1919 to 1923. Of these, the 5 chief documents were the 5 treaties of peace with the defeated powers, named from the sites in the neighborhood of Paris, where they were signed. These were a Treaty of Versailles with Germany, June 28, 1919, Treaty of Saint-Germain with Austria, September 10, 1919, Treaty of Neuilly with Bulgaria, November 27, 1919, Treaty of Trianon with Hungary, June 4, 1920, and the Treaty of Sèvres with Turkey, August 20, 1920. The last of these, the Treaty of Sèvres with Turkey, was never ratified and was replaced by a new treaty signed at Lausanne in 1923. The peace settlements made in this period were subjected to vigorous and detailed criticism in the 2 decades 1919 to 1939. This criticism was as ardent from the victors as from the vanquished. Although this attack was largely aimed at the terms of the treaties, the real causes of the attack did not lie in these terms, which were neither unfair nor ruthless, were far more lenient than any settlement which might have emerged from a German victory, and which created a new Europe which was, at least politically, more just than the Europe of 1914. The causes of the discontent with the settlements of 1919 to 1923 rested on the procedures which were used to make these settlements rather than on the terms of the settlements themselves. Above all, there was discontent at the contrast between the procedures which were used and the procedures which pretended to be used, as well as between the high-minded principles which were supposed to be applied and those which really were applied. The peoples of the victorious nations had taken to heart their wartime propaganda about the rights of small nations, making the world safe for democracy, and putting an end both to power politics and to secret diplomacy. These ideas had been given concrete form in Wilson's 14 points. Whether the defeated powers felt the same enthusiasm for these high ideals is subject to dispute, but they had been promised, on November 5, 1918, that the peace settlements would be negotiated and would be based on the 14 points. When it became clear that the settlements were to be imposed rather than negotiated, that the 14 points had been lost in the confusion, and that the terms of the settlements had been reached by a process of secret negotiations from which the small nations had been excluded, and in which power politics played a much larger role than the safety of democracy, there was a revulsion of feeling among the treaties, against the treaties. In Britain and Germany, propaganda barrages were aimed against these settlements until by 1929 most of the Western world had feelings of guilt and shame whenever they thought of the Treaty of Versailles. There was a good deal of sincerity in these feelings, especially in England and in the United States, but there was also a great deal of insincerity behind them in all countries. In England, the same groups, often the same people, who had made the wartime propaganda in the peace settlements were loudest in their complaint that the latter had fallen far below the ideals of the former, while all the while their real aims were to use power politics to the benefit of Britain. Certainly, there were grounds for criticism, and equally certainly, the terms of the peace settlements were far from perfect. But criticism should have been directed rather at the hypocrisy and lack of realism in the ideals of the wartime propaganda, and at the lack of honesty of the chief negotiators in carrying on the pretense that these ideas were still in effect while they violated them daily, and necessarily violated them. The settlements were clearly made by secret negotiations, by the great powers exclusively, and by power politics. They had to be. No settlements would ever have been made on any other basis. The failure of the chief negotiators, at least the Anglo-Americans, to admit this as regrettable, but behind their reluctance to admit it is the even more regrettable fact that a lack of political experience and political education of the American and English electorates made it dangerous for the negotiators to admit the facts of life in international political relationships. It is clear that the peace settlements were made by an organization which was chaotic and by a procedure which was fraudulent. None of this was deliberate. It arose rather from weakness and from ignorance, from a failure to decide, before the peace was made, who would make it, how it was to be made, and on what principles it would be based. The normal way to make peace after a war, in which the victors form a coalition, would be for the victors to hold a conference, agree on the terms they hope to get from the defeated, and then have a congress with these latter to impose these terms, either with or without discussion and compromise. It was tacitly assumed in October and November 1918 that this method was to be used to end the existing war. But this Congress method could not be used in 1919 for several reasons. The members of the victorious coalition were so numerous, 32 allied and associated powers, that they could have agreed on terms only slowly and after considerable preliminary organization. This preliminary organization never occurred, largely because President Wilson was too busy to participate in the process, was unwilling to delegate any real authority to others, and with a relatively few intensely held ideas like the League of Nations, democracy, and self-determination, had no taste for the details of organization. Wilson was convinced that if he could only get the League of Nations accepted, any undesirable details in the terms of the treaties could be remedied later through the League. Lloyd George and Clemenceau made use of this conviction to obtain numerous provisions in the terms which were undesirable to Wilson but highly desirable to them. The time necessary for a preliminary conference or preliminary planning was also lacking. Lloyd George wanted to carry out his campaign pledge of immediate demobilization, and Wilson wanted to get back to his duties as President of the United States. Moreover, if the terms had been drawn up at a preliminary conference, they would have resulted from compromises between the many powers concerned, and these compromises would have broken down as soon as any effort was made to negotiate with the Germans later. Since the Germans had been promised the right to negotiate, it became clear that the terms could not first be made the subject of public compromise in a full preliminary conference. Unfortunately, by the time the victorious great powers realized all this, and decided to make the terms by secret negotiations among themselves, invitations had been sent to all the victorious powers to come to an inter-allied conference to make preliminary terms. As a solution to this embarrassing situation, the peace was made on two levels. On one level, in the full glare of publicity, the Inter-Allied Conference became the Plenary Peace Conference, and with considerable fanfare did nothing. On the other level, the great powers worked out their peace terms in secret, and when they were ready, imposed them simultaneously on the conference and on the Germans. This had not been intended. In fact, it was not clear to anyone just what was being done. As late as February 22nd, Balfour, the British Foreign Secretary, still believed they were working on preliminary peace terms, and the Germans believed the same on April 15th. While the great powers were negotiating in secret, the full conference met several times under rigid rules designed to prevent action. These sessions were governed by the iron hand of Clemenceau, who heard the motions he wanted, jammed through those he desired, and answered protests by outright threats to make peace without any consultation with the lesser powers at all, and dark references to the millions of men the great powers had under arms. On February 14th, the conference was given the draft of the Covenant of the League of Nations, and on April 11th the draft of the International Labour Office. Both were accepted on April 28th. On May 6th came the text of the Treaty of Versailles, only one day before it was given to the Germans. At the end of May came the draft of the Treaty of Saint-Germain with Austria. While this futile show was going on in public, the great powers were making peace in secret. Their meetings were highly informal. When the military leaders were present, the meetings were known as the Supreme War Council. When the military leaders were absent, as they usually were, after January 12th, the group was known as the Supreme Council or the Council of Ten. It consisted of the head of government and the foreign minister of each of the five great powers, Britain, the United States, France, Italy, and Japan. This group met 46 times from January 12 to March 24, 1919. It worked very ineffectively. At the middle of March, because a sharp dispute over the German-Polish frontier leaked to the press, the Council of Ten was reduced to a Council of Four: Lloyd George, Wilson, Clemenceau, Orlando. These four, with Orlando frequently absent, held over 200 meetings in a period of 13 weeks, March 27th to June 28th. They put the Treaty of Versailles into form in 3 weeks and did the preliminary work on the treaty with Austria. When the treaty with Germany was signed on June 28, 1919, the heads of government left Paris and the Council of Ten ended. So also did the Plenary Conference. The five foreign ministers, Balfour, Lansing, Pétion, Titoni, and Mackinac, were left in Paris as the Council of Heads of Delegations, with full powers to complete the peace settlements. This group finished the treaties with Austria and Bulgaria, and had them both signed. They disbanded on January 10, 1920, leaving behind an executive committee, the Conference of Ambassadors. This consisted of the ambassadors of the four great powers in Paris, plus a French representative. This group held 200 meetings in the next 3 years, and continued to meet until 1931. It supervised the execution of the 3 peace treaties already signed, negotiated the peace treaty with Hungary, and performed many purely political acts which had no treaty basis, such as drawing the Albanian frontier in November 1921. In general, in the decade after the peace conference, the Conference of Ambassadors was the organization by which the great powers ruled Europe. It acted with power, speed, and secrecy in all issues delegated to it. When issues arose which were too important to be treated in this way, the Supreme Council was occasionally reunited. This was done about 25 times in the 3 years 1920 to 22, usually in regard to reparations, economic reconstruction, and acute political problems. The most important of these meetings of the Supreme Council were held at Paris, London, San Remo, Boulogne, and Spa in 1920, at Paris and London in 1921, and at Paris, Genoa, The Hague, and London in 1922. This valuable practice was ended by Britain in 1923 in protest against the French determination to use force to compel Germany to fulfill the reparations clauses of the peace treaty. At all of these meetings, as at the peace conference itself, the political leaders were assigned by groups of experts and interested persons, sometimes self-appointed. Many of these experts were members or associates of the international banking fraternity. At the Paris Peace Conference, the experts numbered thousands and were organized into official staffs by most countries, even before the war ended.